Hello, and welcome to this lecture over the causes, context, and background of the Cold War. We're going to look at how World War II kind of led us to the Cold War and what some of the major events were in the early years of the Cold War. So, looking at the context, the background, the opening events that led to the Cold War, you can't do that without looking at World War II. World War II, again, on the sides of the Allies, the big three, you have, of course, the Soviet Union, Britain, and America as the big three. And they started meeting in the last few years of World War II. One of the major conferences we saw in the early days was the Tehran Conference held in Iran between, again, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. They planned on what they're going to do to defeat the Axis powers, to defeat Hitler, and begin discussing certain things they would want to see at the end of the war. Of course, the Soviet Union being invaded by Germany early on in the war, they wanted to bring in the Americans and the British to open up a second front as soon as possible. That did not happen, as we talked about in the last unit. But they still agreed to do it, just not kind of when Stalin wanted it. Stalin, of course, is being hammered by the Nazis and putting up lots of fight. The tide of the war is turning in the favor. It's turning towards the favor of the Americans, British, and the Soviets. So they are wanting to kind of figure some post-war things out, figure out how unconditional surrender will work and what the boundaries of post-war Europe will look like. However, because we see again a second front in the West and France avoided and pushed off, this causes distrust between the Americans, the British, and the Soviets. With the Soviets kind of, feeling a type of way that they were kind of left behind by their allies. And again, as we've discussed, and I've said time and time again, I can't understate the sacrifice of the Soviet Union. 25 million lives, 12 million soldiers, 12 million civilians, just a gigantic sacrifice that they gave up. Nowhere near the sacrifice at the human level of the British or the Americans. So, of course, if you lose that many people and your allies are not really putting in their fair share of the war, that's going to cause you to not feel, uh, you know, look at them in a positive light. The most famous conference the Big Three had was at Yalta in 1945. We're seeing the war drastically in a different state of affairs by February 1945. It's the war's only got a few months left, honestly, in Europe. D-Day was successful. The Second Front did open up eventually, and we do see the post-war Europe kind of taking hold. The Soviet Union has taken over vast portions of Eastern Europe. America is, however, not even into the past the Rhine River yet. The Soviets, however, are closing in on Berlin, and they'll have Berlin in a few weeks after this conference. They agree at this conference on a occupation of Germany, divided between the French, British, Soviets, and Americans. And the Soviets are demanding heavy reparations against the Germans after the war. With the destructive violence that the Nazis enacted against Eastern Europe and the Soviets and the Slavic people, the Soviets are wanting, some sort of payment for their sacrifice. And the big three here are kind of on the same page. There's also an agreement, surprisingly, by liberal, democratic, capitalist America and Britain that communist politicians could be elected in Eastern Europe. However, that deal was to keep the Soviet Union out of elections. That was not followed through by the Soviets. However, surprisingly, we do see these capitalist nations agree to communist politicians who, again, were some of the strongest fighters in the war against the fascists. Liberals, capitalists often colluded, especially if they're on the wealthier side of things, with the invading Nazis. Finally, the Potsdam Conference. We see the big three kind of go through some struggles here. Originally, FDR was a part of the conference, but he passed away in 1945 after the Yalta Conference, and that put his vice president, Harry Truman, on in the president spot. Truman had a totally different relationship and opinion of Stalin, a staunch anti-communist. He had no prerogative to make an alliance or be friendly towards Stalin. Truman, going back on the demands that were agreed upon at Yalta, says we need immediate free and fair elections in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. He's taking back the agreement that was brought on, and a staunch conservative Churchill is more than happy to kind of go along with Truman there. Stalin refuses. He already made a deal at the previous conference. He is not going to go for that. Additionally, Russia or the Soviet Union has been invaded by an invading Germany for the past 30 years. He needed a buffer in Eastern Europe in order to keep out those Germans who didn't have a great opinion of Slavic peoples that existed in that region. So Stalin again wanted to keep his deal that was already set up, and he needed a buffer against the Germans. And the best way to do that was to put get a collection of nations in Eastern Europe that could put some space between the Soviet Union and a potentially aggressive Germany. Because again, there's no certainty in 1945 that another war wouldn't break out in 5, 10, 15 years, just like we saw after World War I. Additionally, there's an agreement made that a United Nations will be formed, a beefed up League of Nations that would have more participation across the globe. But the United Nations really was formed to fight the Axis powers. But we kind of see this group eventually evolve into the United Nations of today that would be able to implement sanctions and have a military force attached to it. All right. So Europe after the war is just a mess. There's displaced persons across the continent. World War I was incredibly destructive. World War II just takes that destruction to an entirely different level. No country in Europe was left untouched by the war. America was an outlier, of course, because America was, two oceans separated between the violence of World War II, both in Asia and in Europe. But you can't understate just how destroyed Europe was. Millions of people moved, pushed around, had their homes invaded, and then were displaced once they were kicked out, or vice versa. It was just a disaster for a number of years in Europe. You see major cities across the continent, from Leningrad to London in the west. You have just the entire continent and most of these cities just destroyed. You have 25 million displaced persons. So that means people that were kicked out of their house and home and forced to be vagrants or to wander around because, their home was burnt down, taken, destroyed. So 25 million people in the Soviet Union, 20 million in Germany, 30 million across Eastern Europe, forced from their homes due to the invading Nazis who were looking to get Lebensraum. 13 million Germans fled west as the Soviets were marching back and pushing the Germans back into Germany, forcing more violence, more rapes, more pillaging by the Soviets, and again against Germans who again were conquering land and taking it from people in Eastern Europe. So they were getting what they did back, sometimes twicefold. The United Nations opened up camps across the continent and received funding to house, feed, and clothe people after the war. 760 camps across the continent. Again, sometimes people could not make it home. Sometimes people were stuck where they were stuck. For example, displaced people who were from the Soviet Union, who were, staunch communists, supportive of the Red Army and their actions, they were persecuted. They were not allowed to return home because the Soviets feared that they were perhaps corrupted by the capitalist West. So they were either, kept out, or when they returned home, perhaps sent to the Gulag or executed in some cases. Unfortunately, we see pogroms occur across Eastern Europe as well. Unfortunately, not everyone knew what the Jewish population of Europe had just happened, but with the Nazi ideology not dying quite so quickly, we do see pogroms take place across Eastern Europe, still inspired by anti-Semitism, still inspired by the Nazis, eugenics and racial superiority ideas. We still see that happen across Eastern Europe as well in the years following the war. And as previously stated, we see Germany and Austria divided into 4 occupation zones. You can see the Germany map right here. Oops. With Britain, the Soviet Union, America, and France getting a different portion of the nation. A few things to point out. We see right here, most importantly, the city of Berlin. The city of Berlin, the capital of Germany, is entirely surrounded by the Soviet Union zone. However, if you were to zoom in right there and see what's inside this, how Berlin is divided up, you see the same sort of situation here, where the city of Berlin is divided into a Soviet zone, an American zone, a French zone, and a British zone. We will talk more about that later. So, how did the Allies get revenge against their enemies in the war? Persecution of these criminals, of these war criminals, of these Nazis, of their war crimes through trials and executions. So, we see a staggering number of war crimes convictions. 100,000 Germans or Austrians were convicted of war crimes. The main trials for Europe were the Nuremberg trials, held in Germany, ran by the Americans for the most part, alongside the British and the Soviets. But we see that happen in kind of under the American lens. We see the Soviets get their revenge as well. Again, the Soviets were one of the biggest targets of the Nazis, so they were very, very focused on retribution and revenge, violence, severe punishments, violent executions against the Germans and the collaborators that worked with the Nazis. Again, because the violence that had just been so awful against the people of Eastern Europe, the Soviets wanted to exact that same type of violence against the Germans. This is illustrated in the film Come and See. And it's free on YouTube. It was released in the 1980s by the Soviet Union, but it just shows you the horrific violence that occurred against the people of Eastern Europe by the Nazis, and to an extent, some of the revenge that those people got against the Nazis. Towards civilians, you see a variety of punishments placed against civilians and people that collaborated or accused of collaborating with the invading Nazis. Women in France, women in Italy, and other places, the Netherlands, for example, were sometimes accused or stated to have participated in horizontal collaboration, which you might be able to guess what that entails. But these women who were, sometimes raped by Nazis, sometimes willingly engaged in sexual acts with Nazis, had their heads shaved, and were marched through town and paraded. Again, women don't have a great place in society in the 1940s, so this is par for the course. Women, getting a harsh punishment. This sometimes, was more than just a public shaming. And again, this is a European tradition. It goes back to the Charivari. We in fact see Charivaris across Europe following World War II and in the decades after. People held on to grudges and knew who wronged them after the war. And we sometimes see, villages, carry out Charivaris or public shamings or sometimes executions 5, 10, 15 years after the war, remembering who killed who. Or if you were returning back to your hometown after you were kicked out and pushed around Europe for a few years, you're going to remember that and word's going to spread. Looking at the Holocaust, we do see Americans and others force Germans and civilians that claimed they didn't know what was going on in the Holocaust, force them to tour the death camps, toward the destruction that the Nazis had enacted across Europe. So that happened as well. You can see some propaganda posters distributed by the Americans here against the Germans. These atrocities are your fault, it says to the Germans, showcasing the horrible acts we saw in the Holocaust. Lastly, denazification was the main process we see throughout Europe, or that was attempted throughout Europe, from west to the east. And this is when Nazi Party members were identified, punished, purged, executed. They were taken out of power, and you see signs, you see buildings, you see people just taken out of power as quickly as possible. Again, some acts are more severe than others, but for the most part, the Americans and the Soviets attempted some form of this. The state of Prussia, we've been talking about for most of this class, was disassembled and erased from the history books. There is not a Prussian state you can visit today, because the Allied powers thought that a Prussian identity perhaps was pushing Germany to an ultramilitarism that we saw in World War I and World War II. However, unfortunately, with denazification, this was not always thorough. We do see scientists, industrialists, and some government officials picked up and scooped up by the Americans and by the Soviets in things like Operation Paperclip. Nazis that had worked on missile development, Nazis that had worked in the scientific fields, Nazis that were on the cutting edge of nuclear science and had just an insane level of scientific knowledge. They were scooped up by the Americans and by the Soviets and never punished for their crimes. In fact, they were celebrated and kind of tucked away in American and Soviet towns. And they were used for the next war, the Cold War, and pitted against each other in some places. So while denazification was, in theory, effective against some people, it was not 100% thorough. And in Europe today, you can see the limits of the denazification process after World War II, and unfortunately how far-right fascist groups are coming back into power in Europe today. This process leaves us with two superpowers at the end of the war, the Soviet Union and America. So how does the America kind of go about helping to rebuild the economy of Europe at the end of World War II? The big tool that the Americans used was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a massive program, implemented by the Americans, mostly towards Western European nations, that promised loans and money and funds to these European nations that desperately needed it, if and only if they promised to adopt and maintain capitalist principles in their economy, based on free market trade and capitalism. We do see the Korean War begin in this period as well, in the 1950s. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But that also helps the economies of the West as well, as they need to gear up again to fight another war, albeit a smaller war, but still producing weapons, etc., does add to your economy. Here we see a tipping point. Stalin refuses the Marshall Plan. Stalin does not want capitalist bankers and lawyers and loan clerks and promises to be made between the Eastern Europe and the West. We do see a different Soviet program come into place, which we'll talk about in a bit. But again, Stalin is a big opponent of the Marshall Plan. However, going back to Western Europe, we do see the Marshall Plan incredibly successful across the board, where it was allowed to be enacted. We do see an economic miracle of sorts in Western Europe. Again, because we do have tons of funds and money being pumped into these economies from the West. These funds do eventually allow Europe to get out of the 1940s a little bit better than they were in the years during the 1940s, and see their economies begin to recover. Not only was the Marshall Plan successful, but we do see a wide embrace of Keynesian economics. John Keynes, if you remember him from the last unit, he was that economist that advocated for deficit spending, to keep employment as high as possible. When you have high employment, you have everyone working, everyone paying taxes, and you have a fully functioning economy. If you have massive unemployment, you have people not working, not paying taxes, leading to problems. So the embrace of Keynesian economics, or deficit spending to keep everyone employed, everyone working, and providing government programs to keep everyone employed, that lasts until the 1970s. So what does that look like in Europe? Well, let's start with Britain and Scandinavia. These two nations adopt a full embrace of Keynesian economics and social democratic governance. The Scandinavian nations, Sweden, etc., already did do that to an extent. They started during the Great Depression, but now Britain is getting in on the game. They see generous state-sponsored benefits in their nations. And in Britain, this is led by the Labour Party. The Labour Party, kicked Churchill out of power. The voters of Britain kicked Churchill out of power and replaced it with the Labour Party that really wanted to thank the British people for their fighting during the war and for their sacrifices that they made during the war. And this is their role. This is the reward to the people for fighting so hard. That's the way the Labour Party put it. And they really wanted to just provide as much as they could to the people, paid for through taxes, to just keep them going, and to help them kind of not lose hope in this tough time of the 1940s. So what did they get? What did the British people get? We see free medical services, free hospital care, generous government-funded pensions, and unemployment money. The wealthy, the people that have more funds than the rest, they are paying more for this than the poor. Just thoroughly increasing the standard of living across Britain. We also see, to pay for this, besides taxing the wealthy, we see the nationalization of industries, banks, industries, utilities, and public transportation services, all paid for by the government or taken over by the government. Again, the Labour Party really wanted to create a cradle-to-grave welfare state to thank the British for their sacrifice during the war and to provide basic necessities for living. But perhaps more importantly, this kept a communist revolution from impacting Britain. When you have a destroyed country with a weak government, and everything's kind of up in the air about what could happen next, that poses a serious risk of revolution to your nation. So did the Labour Party enact these benefits to thank the British people for their sacrifice? Perhaps, but it was also perhaps to keep a communist uprising from spreading in their nation. Sweden and Scandinavia follow similar models. Looking at Germany, Western Germany at least, we see, and we see this in Italy and France as well, we see the strength and growth of these Christian democratic parties. These parties, again, more left-wing than you might expect. They weren't quite as left-wing as the Scandinavian political parties or the British Labour Party, but they did support some left-wing ideas while still being staunchly capitalist and focused on liberalism and free market economics. They are called Christian parties because they rejected authoritarian dictators, but they supported family values and things that, a family might support, such as education subsidies, housing subsidies, transportation, and public health insurance. These parties were particularly supported by women who are now voters and now, have a growing amount of political power. So these Christian parties, while conservative, and have grown more conservative, more right-wing over the years, they are still technically, supportive of some left-wing ideas. Again, public insurance, public health insurance, public transportation, and housing, things that left-wing parties support today. Looking at Portugal, Spain, and Greece, while they are typically on the side of NATO and America, during this period, they are not necessarily democratic. Again, Francisco Franco, the Spanish nationalist that won during the Spanish Civil War, stayed in power until 1975. with Portugal kind of following a similar model over there. All right, let's get into some of the big events of that started the Cold War in Germany. So again, as we saw on our previous slide, we see Germany divided into occupational zones. The British, Americans, French, and the Soviets all divided up Germany. But in 1948, we start to see some sort of competition between the nations. One deal that was made at the Yalta Conference was for uh, Germany to kind of keep its currency, the Reichsmark. We this was set up by this was agreed upon between the Soviet Union and America, again between Stalin and Franklin D. Roosevelt. However, Roosevelt's long gone. Truman's in power now, so we see that that agreement violated. We see the British, the French, and the Americans change the currency from the Reichsmark to the Deutschmark. Perhaps this was done to denazify Germany. Again, Reichsmark implies, a kingdom, an empire, reminiscent of what we saw in Germany during World War I and World War II. Or maybe it was done to anger Stalin. Who knows? But this breaks a deal that Stalin made and between his allies, or at least who he thought was his allies. This signals to Stalin that more U.S. involvement is coming into Europe, and that U.S. is going to come in and start to kind of bring its capitalist ideology more into this continent that is, for the most part, leaning left, and relatively grateful towards the Soviet Union for sacrificing so many people to bring about an end to the Nazi Empire. So, in response to this breach of trust, we see Stalin, make a move. He wants to bring his friends, or his former friends, maybe at this point, back to the negotiating table to talk about what happened and to figure out what's going on in Germany, what to do with Germany. So again, like I said on a previous slide, inside Germany, in East Germany at least, you see Berlin, the capital of Germany, surrounded by the Soviet zone. Berlin, there are American zones in Berlin, there's French zones in Berlin, there are British, French, and American zones in Berlin, and a Soviet zone in Berlin. What we see happen here is Stalin kind of surrounds the city, cuts off all trains, all roads, any type of transportation, at least ground transportation, to Berlin. He cuts off all this transportation and attempts to kind of starve out the city and surround the city by Soviets in order to bring the Americans to the negotiating table. More or less saying, you guys need to be in the city too. It's an important city. But how are you going to do that when I have control over this entire surrounding area? You guys need to come and talk to me so we can figure out what to do about this situation that you have caused by breaking so many of these agreements from Yalta, Tehran, etc. So the West, America, instead of negotiating with Stalin and the Soviets, they respond by rescuing the citizens of Berlin. They don't need Stalin. They don't talk to him. They airlift supplies in. They fly in supplies, food, etc., provisions into Berlin and into West Berlin, the side that the British, French, and Americans controlled, literally keeping them alive and keeping them fed with days and days and days of airdrops from 1948 to 1949. Almost a year goes by of airdrops when the Soviet Union just gives up and reopens the roads, allowing the. So after the Soviet Union reopened the roads, the Berlin airlift was over, resulting in a Berlin that was again divided between the West and the East. That's eventually going to lead to things like the Berlin Wall, etc. But we also see slowly over the next few years, following World War II, a invisible wall fall down and divide Europe into two. You can see it on this map right over here. Um, this was called by Winston Churchill as the Iron Curtain, and the rest of Europe called it as well. We generally see a Western Europe allied with America and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance meant to contain and stop the spread of Soviet influence. This was put in place after 1949, and we see America support this alliance and this half of the continent. And then on the east, we see the Soviets, kind of spread their influence, their communist influence across the eastern part of the continent. Again, as the Soviets have pushed back against the invading Germans, they kept a lot of influence in those areas they saved. People were grateful for the Soviets and their fight against the atrocious acts of the Nazis. Again, the Nazis wanted to exterminate not only Jewish people and other ethnic minorities, but Slavic people, which made up large portions of population groups in these Eastern European nations. So these people were thankful. But B, the Soviets wanted to again establish a buffer zone and maintain some sort of political power and dominance in Eastern Europe. That being said, the Americans wanted to have political dominance in Western Europe as well. This was called out by Western European leaders such as Charles de Gaulle, who criticized NATO for its close association with America and its dominance by the United States of America. So, as NATO is created, again, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we see the Soviet Union create their own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. And this, again, is meant to stop the spread of capitalism and to support communist ideas worldwide. That was formulated in 1955. One such action occurs in Korea, in which we see the Soviet Union back Korean communists in Korea as Korea's, breaking free from Japanese control that occurred during World War II. We see a communist contingent supported by the Soviets and the Chinese communists eventually as well. That comes into play. And then we see America jump into that war as well from the South, supporting the Southern the Southern Korean leaders, which were dictators and meant to be a bulwark against the communists who are invading and spreading their ideology from the North. Here on this map, again, you can see how Berlin is divided, with, again, Berlin right here in the middle of the Soviet zone. Nevertheless, throughout the Cold War, we see the American, French, and British zones supported by the West and kept afloat in what some has called the Sea of Red, or the Sea of Communism. Despite the attempts of the Soviets, that little portion of democracy and capitalism was kept alive. What else leads to the events of the Cold War during this period? We see Truman, again, a staunch anti-communist American president, support anti-communist forces wherever he could. Again, the West was more or less agreed upon, that they agreed with each other that they needed to stamp out communism where they could. In addition to the Marshall Plan, Truman's government, enacts other legislation and other bills that will fund anti-communist fighters across Europe. Again, I can't understate that the biggest fighters of fascism and the Nazis in World War II were communists and socialists across the continent, not just including the Soviet Union, did the most to prevent a fascist takeover of Europe. How quickly American leaders forgot the sacrifice of these communists across the continent. As soon as the war ended, Truman cut off aid to the Soviet Union, which, truth be told, the Soviet Union probably didn't need, but it was still kind of an aggressive move against a former ally, or at that point in September 1945, a current ally. We also see then Truman fund actions against communists across Europe. The Truman Doctrine goes along with the American policy of containment, which is going to be put in place throughout the next several decades in the American government, which meant to contain or stop the spread of communism wherever it attempted to spread its ideology. So, as we see, Truman get, aggressive towards the communists, we see more acts and bills passed in the American government against communism. A civil war breaks out in Greece and the Balkans, where you have communist fighters who fought against Nazis in World War II. Again, the Balkans were a tough zone full of fighting during the war, often overlooked, including by me. we see the communists attempting to take over the government, lead a communist revolution of sorts in Greece. Truman funds people, funds forces, including dictators, to fight against these communists, and he is successful. Turkey, we see the same thing. We see again the American government funding militaristic actions against communists to prevent this region, this part of the world, from becoming communist. Turkey is also welcomed into NATO to keep it on the side of the capitalist regime that is kind of running NATO and running the West. America funds tons of money, tons of sources, tons of money to other nations across Europe and the world. To be honest, preventing communism from spreading. This happens in Central and South America. This happens in Africa. This happens in Asia. This happens in Europe. And the CIA, American spies, American secret agencies were often used to prevent the capture of governments by communist forces. One such operation that the CIA enacted was Operation Gladio, which again funded groups, funded people, funded violent actors to prevent communists from taking power by any means necessary, including violence. So again, America, turns anti-communist following the years of World War II. It goes from being a staunch ally of the Soviet Union to its biggest opponent and attacking communists across the world, from Europe to Africa to Asia to Central and South America. Within Europe, again, we do see communist parties successful, especially in the West. Again, communists did save the day in the eyes of many Europeans during the war, so it's not unusual to see these people supportive of communism. We see 28% of France vote for communists in 1946. Italy has a gigantic communist political party. And we see China. China is dominated by communists following World War II. The communists win the hearts and minds of the people during World War II by fighting for the people, fighting against the Japanese, fighting against the nationalists, and they become a gigantic communist nation in 1949. Additionally, we see the Soviet Union become stronger and challenge the power of America by detonating its own atomic weapon in 1949. From here on out, we're going to see both nations restructure their governments and their industries, their societies, to fight each other and to create a force that fights for communism or a force that fights against communism. One last point, like I said, the Soviets do create an economic entity to rival that of the Marshall Plan by the Americans, and that is called Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And that is, again, going to increase more divisions against the West and the East. What was life like in Eastern Europe? Again, just like with the West, Eastern Europe was thoroughly destroyed by the war. And again, I can't overstate it. The Soviet Union sacrificed millions of lives to defeat the fascists, to defeat the Nazis. Americans did, the British did, the French did. All European countries lost a great deal of people. The Soviets lost, though, 25 million. There's almost no comparison besides Germany, who was a belligerent in the war and started the war. In the Soviet Union and in Russia today, they don't call World War II World War II. They call it the Great Patriotic War of the Fatherland. This thoroughly grew Soviet Russian nationalism. This thoroughly made the people of Russia proud of Stalin and proud of the sacrifice of the Russian people during this war. By 46, we see Stalin moving back towards a more authoritarian control of the state of the Soviet Union. Again, focused on the next war, which it looked like it was going to be between a militaristic America, a militaristic NATO, and a remilitarized West Germany, which again was done under the protection and support of America and NATO. To battle these forces, again, we saw Comecon established, but we also see information bureaus established to kind of help the Soviet Union keep abreast of what's happening across the world, across the continent. Again, to create a buffer zone to prevent another invasion from the West, like we just saw the Soviets deal with in World War II, we see Stalin and his allies create a league of alliances across Eastern Europe, made up of uh, you know communist states: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria formed up the East Bloc. Um, these were all communist states that had leaders handpicked by the Soviet Union. Even though these countries were ready for communism, accepting of communism for the most part, and had tons of local leaders that were communists and fought the good fight against the Nazis. The Soviet Union often and regularly handpicked their own leaders in these places. They wanted someone who would be a puppet who would serve the interests of the Soviet Union, which alienated a fair number of people, not just in the East Bloc, but in across Europe as well. The only person who kind of got to keep their spot was Joseph Broz Tito, the communist resistance fighter of Yugoslavia. He survived these purges of non-Soviet communist leaders or communist leaders who supported the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union's army never made it into Yugoslavia. So he was able to maintain a degree of independence. With a communist takeover of these countries, across Eastern Europe, we see the same social safety nets and benefits enacted in these nations. We see 5-year plans, both in agriculture and industry, across these nations. And they, developed thoroughly, just like the Soviet Union had done during the 1930s and 1940s. They model and follow the Soviets' advances. One thing that happens in these Soviet and communist states across Eastern Europe was a focus on on machines and military goods, weapons, machines, etc. Because again, the Soviets predicted another invasion from the West. They were not entirely wrong. The West does continue to fight communist forces around the globe, but they may have overstated the need for these weapons. They often sacrifice the production of consumer goods and things that make people happier, and emphasize the production of machinery, weapons, etc. The underemphasis on consumer goods, was based on the idea that consumer goods made people weak, and was based on capitalism and individualism. And the Soviets were not about those ideas. And we'll talk more about that at a future lecture. In the East, we do see revolts against this Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe. We see it in East Germany. We see it in Czechoslovakia. We see it in Hungary throughout the years. But the earliest protest was the East German Revolt, which led the Soviet army, who was monitoring and present in East Germany at the time. They shot and killed 55 protesters. Again, instilling Soviet rule and domination over not just East Germany, but Eastern Europe. We see Joseph Stalin pass away in 1953. His grip on the country and on the nation begins to change things a bit for the Soviet Union. His funeral was attended by thousands of people. You see mobs crush each other because they were so grateful for what Joseph Stalin had did. And again, he did commit acts of genocide. He did do violent things across the Soviet Union, across Eastern Europe. But he did bring a tremendous people out of poverty, out of serfdom, out of the feudal system and into the modern age. Just the amount of literacy that happens, the amount of advancement that happens, the amount of industrialization that happens is hard to beat. You really can't beat it in modern world history. And that was done under the leadership of Joseph Stalin and his associates. Again, he ruled through fear and terror, but the Soviet Union did change the world as it grew from a country that was being invaded by the West and the rest of the world to a superpower by the end of the 1940s. So his successor is a man named Nikita Khrushchev, who attempts to change things. Nikita Khrushchev was one of the leaders of the Red Army as it was being attacked by the Germans at Stalingrad. Khrushchev, through a a campaign of pressure, and you can see some of this done in the movie the Death of Stalin, which is a dark comedy. But Khrushchev wins power and begins to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union. What does that mean? We see the secret police power curbed. We see labor camps closed, forced labor camps closed at least. We see reform and a liberalization of culture inside the Soviet Union. We see people criticize Stalin and his missteps during World War II. And we see the imprisonment of people who were put in prison unjustly. We see those prison sentences ended. We see works of art, Dr. Zhivago, and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which actually showed the people of the Soviet Union and the world what living in a gulag was like. That was published, and it was permitted by Khrushchev. Again, we still see one political party in the Soviet Union, the Russian Communist Party, or the Soviet Communist Party, but we don't see the terror, secret police, and the amount of purges and awful things that happened under Joseph Stalin come back. Khrushchev was more open to cooperation and working with capitalist nations. He was still a staunch communist, but he believed that we can't just meet a violent enemy in the Americas, in the United States of America, with more violence and more death and more destruction. So Khrushchev was open to cooperating with America, but also open to offering support to places in North and South America, to places in Asia, to places in Africa that wanted to become an ally and perhaps a communist ally with the Soviet Union. With this de-Stalinization, we do see some relaxation of tensions for a bit and for a few moments here and there throughout the 1950s and 60s. Throughout the later 1950s and 60s, we see the Cold War nevertheless ramp up, even though Khrushchev was in power. We see in 1956, we see the idea of the many roads to socialism idea spread throughout that part of Eastern Europe. Poland was always a resistant player in the game of communism in Eastern Europe. Some factions, some groups liked communism in Poland, some did not like communism in Poland. One big pressure point in Poland was the forced collectivized agriculture. The farming collectives that we saw established under 5-year plans in the Soviet Union and spread throughout Eastern Europe, they were especially not accepted in Poland. So that point of contention does lead, again, the idea of many roads to socialism enacted in Eastern Europe. In Hungary in the same year, we see the citizens of Budapest come to power and call for a reformed communist prime minister. He promised to implement democratic reforms, ease repression, and leave the Warsaw Pact. This worried the Soviet Union. So as revolution in Hungary kind of grows to a boil, we see the Soviet Union send in troops and tanks to crush the rebellion. If you're familiar with communist ideology, this is where the term tanky comes from. Meaning in order to keep communism and spread communism throughout the world, or to keep it in place, violence is sometimes necessary, and that's what the Soviet Union did here. Brutally crushing the revolt, executing the perpetrators, and executing Imre Nagy, the guy that led this revolt. The revolutionaries of Hungary thought the United Nations, the newly established United Nations, would step in and support their plea for help against the Soviets, but that did not happen. The Soviet Union did have a place on the Security Council, and we just didn't see a widespread level of support for this rebellion. This does send a clear message, though, to Eastern Europeans that they need to abide by the domination of the Soviets, that you're going to follow the Soviet leadership and run communism their way, for the most part, with Poland being an exception. But if you didn't follow their rules and their ideas regarding communism, that would be a mistake. Again, America does the same thing. If you're not following their capitalist ideology in the way they want, they could play some games, invade you, etc. Use the CIA to instill a rebellion in your nation. as we see across North, South America, Africa, Asia, etc. We do see in Germany the Berlin Wall built. Again, Berlin is split between the capitalist West and the communist East. So the East Germans built a anti-fascist protection rampart to prevent capitalist elements and influencers from infiltrating into the East. So that is built in this period. We also see in the 60s the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba undergoes a communist revolution supported by the Soviets eventually. Again, Cuba was a close ally of America prior to this, with tons of American corporations dominating the sugarcane plantations, working people to death on those brutal tropical sugarcane plantations. People in Cuba lead a revolution inspired by communism, funded by communist states. And we see, a little island nation become communist 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Soon after that, in order to kind of keep America at bay and to keep communism afloat in Cuba, we see the Soviets ship some missiles and some atomic weapons to Cuba. America learns about this, sends some ships to intercept those ships from the Soviet Union, leading to a standoff at sea. It looks like America could kind of, tailspin into a nuclear war between the Soviet Union, but at the last moment, the ships go back to the Soviet Union, and America kind of calls off their ships as well. This was done because America secretly had implemented missiles in Turkey pointing directly at the Soviet Union, and they promised to remove those. Nevertheless, this does escalate tensions between the Soviets and Americans substantially. After the Soviets kind of withdraw at the last minute after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we do see Khrushchev kind of fall out of power in the Soviet Union. He was displaced in a coup against his leadership and placed on house arrest, with his successor being Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev was a bit of a Stalinist in that he was big on the cult of personality and big on force and things like that. So we do see a escalation of arms and arms buildup in the Soviet Union. So across the East Bloc in the 60s and 70s, we do see some policies change here and there, in that people attempted to become more focused on the production of consumer goods in these Soviet economies. That does increase a bit. We see the idea of criticism spread through samizdat, which was underground literature and writings that criticized the totalitarian nature of communist governments in the East Bloc and Eastern Europe. But for the most part, the Soviet line does not change. The communist line of Eastern Europe does not change as far as what's right and what's proper. Finally, looking at the economies of the West, again, capitalism, free trade goes on a whirlwind tour. We see the American superpower lead the way, with Western Europe kind of following America's lead. And we see appliances, cars, credit just grow and grow and grow throughout the West, throughout American society. We see standard of living see a dramatic increase. Consumer goods skyrocket. The number of appliances you could buy skyrocket. Supermarkets are established across the West, with people getting access to radios, TVs, record players, and able to afford these things through buying on credit, getting out loans for cars, houses, whatever you needed. And with these generous social welfare and social security programs from America to Western Europe, people didn't have to worry about saving as much for retirement. You could retire and not have to worry about a 401k or some sort of thing like that, your government funded pension or social security program in America had your back. So it was really a dream to live in this period, in the West at least. You had all these appliances, the world was your oyster, and you did have lots of opportunity to succeed if you were, typically speaking, a white American or a well-off person in Europe that had family ties and deep connections to European society. The Soviet Union did again. We do see an increase in consumer goods in the Soviet Union after the 1960s, but still that always paled in comparison to what we saw in the West. All right, that is it for this lecture. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.